Welcome to part 2 of Module 1, which is Introduction to Intensive Interventions in Reading. And for this part, we're going to be talking about how data-based individualization, or DBI, applies to reading. And before we get started, I want you to take a minute to listen to a teacher share some of the challenges that she has with trying to meet the needs of students who are experiencing really significant reading difficulties. So let's take a minute and watch this video.
I have this new student on my caseload who's having a lot of difficulty with reading. I mean, he's really struggling. I have some good strategies for helping kids with reading, but his needs are so great that it seems like he needs something more or maybe something different. I know that I'm supposed to individualize, but then it feels like I'm trying to design a new lesson every day, and that doesn't feel very cohesive or systematic. We have some intervention programs in the resource room, but I'm not sure if any are right for him or whether they even work. We're also supposed to be progress monitoring our students, but we have so many different assessments, and I'm never sure the best way to use the data. I think I can tell he's not responding, but then what next?
So many of us have faced these similar kinds of challenges, that we have a student or we have students that we're working with that we know are really struggling, that have real needs, and we're not quite sure how we can design and implement intervention for those students that's really going to be intensive enough for them. We have experience with reading, we teach reading, we're reading interventionists, reading teachers, special educators. We understand about reading processes. We have reading tools and strategies that we're comfortable with, maybe assessments and interventions and tools. But we're not quite sure how to put everything together in the way that's going to meet the needs of these really, really challenging students. And that's what DBI is all about. So DBI, or Data-based Individualization, is a process for intensifying and individualizing intervention in reading through the systematic use of assessment data, validated interventions, and research-based adaptation strategies. So DBI is really nothing new, and in fact it shares a lot of features and components with other ways that we think about supporting reading and supporting students in schools. So these are things like intensive intervention, data-based decision-making, SBRR, or scientifically based reading research, individualization or differentiation, MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, response to intervention, also structured literacy. So again, data-based individualization shares a lot of the components or the features of these other ways that we talk about supporting students in reading. So what's different then about DBI? And there's a couple of things. And so one of the things I think is that first, it starts with effective practices. So DBI is really focused on identifying and implementing research-validated tools and strategies implemented with fidelity. So thinking about intervention programs, validated assessment tools, and really thinking about implementing them with integrity and with fidelity. But it's not just about practices, it's also about process. So DBI includes a systematic database process for adjusting instruction to meet individual needs. So it's a way to kind of take these effective practices and put them together in a comprehensive way, and to think about them as how we identify and determine whether students are responding to these practices and how we can adjust those if needed. DBI also helps us really kind of think about these two really important things and ideas that we have, which is standardization and individualization, but how to balance these two, because sometimes it feels like these things are a little bit in conflict. So for example, we're told, and we know that standardization is really important. We know that implementing evidence-based practices with fidelity is key, because these are practices and programs that have been evaluated a certain way, and they show impact and effects when they're implemented that way. So we know that if we veer too much from these, we're not going to get the same effects, that they've really been designed to implement it with fidelity as is. But then that sometimes feels like we're not sure then, what we're allowed to do in terms of adaptations or adjustments, and is that something that we can do and still stay true to the standardization? On the other hand, we also know that individualization is really important. We want to individualize instruction for specific students and really meet their needs, and also be responsive as possible to how they're reacting to instruction, and so to be able to make those kind of ongoing decisions. But at the same time, we don't want to have to start from scratch. We don't want to be designing things from the ground up. We want to be relying on evidence-based tools and strategies. So I think that DBI does a really good job of balancing this idea of standardization and individualization. So again, starting with evidence-based tools in assessment and instruction and intervention, but also then providing a systematic process for how we determine if students are responding and how we can adjust and intensify intervention for those students so that we can really be responsive and try to meet individual student needs. We'll be using this, this graphic or this figure to talk about the process and the steps of DBI. So it starts with identifying a validated intervention program, doing progress monitoring to make sure that students are responding, to see if they're responding, collecting other kinds of assessment data around mastery and diagnostic information, making these kind of intervention adaptations, and then seeing whether they work. And so throughout this module, we'll introduce these features, but then in other modules, we'll go much more in depth for each of these steps of the DBI process. So DBI is an approach or a way to think about intervention that really aligns well with a couple of the really important ways that we provide instruction and intervention in schools. One is through MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, response to intervention process. So DBI fits really well with the MTSS RTI process, and also fits really well within special education in developing and implementing IEPs for students with disabilities. So I want to talk a little bit about how DBI is relevant in both these areas. So when we think about MTS or RTI, we know that this is a process for providing more intensive interventions to students based on their needs. So the way that we often think about this is that all students are getting high quality classroom instruction and reading, and that sort of represents the whole triangle. But we know that just good classroom reading instruction by itself is not going to be enough to meet the needs of all students. So through universal screening and benchmarking assessments, we identify those kids that need something extra, so need some sort of supplemental Tier 2 intervention that layers on top of Tier 1 classroom instruction. And even with high quality classroom instruction and evidence-based supplemental intervention, there's still going to be some of those students that are not responding the way we'd like. And those students require highly individualized intensive interventions at Tier 3. So when we think about DBI, DBI is a process that really helps us understand how we think about and implement Tier 2 supplemental intervention and Tier 3 individualized intervention. So we could use the DBI process to really help us in those tiers of the MTSS process. We can also think about DBI supporting the special education process, and particularly in the development and the implementation of IEPs. So when we have an IEP team, what we're doing is working together to develop an individualized IEP for students, and the DBI process can help us identify what are effective practices in reading intervention and reading assessment for those students. But it also allows us to collect data to ensure that students are responding to those services in the IEP and to make individualized adjustments or intensifications for those students that really are able to tailor the IEP to be what it's supposed to be, provide specially designed instruction, an individualized education program for students with disabilities. So we are now going to go through the process and just give an introduction to each of these steps of the DBI process. So the first one is identifying a validated intervention program. We can think about this as a Tier 2 intervention, a standard protocol intervention, a secondary intervention. And so what we want to do here is we want to start with something that has a good chance of working. So particularly in reading, we have a really strong evidence base around effective programs and practices for students experiencing reading difficulties and students with reading disability. So what we want to be able to do is identify a program that's really going to give us the best chance for meeting the needs of our students. It has a high probability of working with the students similar to the needs of our students. And really that's what an evidence-based program is. It's a program that's been evaluated rigorously and shown to be effective with students with particular needs and particular profile compared to other alternatives. So when we start with an evidence-based program, it gives us a head start to thinking about that this is a program that's worked with kids similar to us, and it's a good choice among many alternatives. And so when we're thinking about intervention options for teaching reading, there's a number of different options that we can think about. We can think about an evidence-supported program, we can think about an evidence-supported practice, and we can also think about promising programs or practices. And we'll talk about these different kind of levels of tools and options that we have. But in DBI, we're really trying to focus on starting with an evidence-supported program. So what we mean by that is something that comes in a comprehensive sort of package that has a clear scope and sequence, that has lessons that progress teaching either one or more skills in a very systematic way. It has very explicit kind of teaching routines or teachers or interventionists can implement with fidelity. And it sort of has example selection and everything that you sort of need to be able to implement with high quality and with consistency. Something that's kind of all there for you. And again, in reading, we have a lot of different options for selecting intervention programs that have evidence and that also target the specific needs that might be similar to the needs of our students. So we have a number of these validated intervention programs available to us in reading. And just for example, these are some types of programs that target specific needs and have been evaluated carefully with careful evidence and are things that we can adopt and implement with high levels of fidelity and provide a great deal of material support, scope and sequence for teachers and interventionists. And we'll talk more about this in another module, but the National Center for Intensive Intervention's tool chart is a great place to look for different reading programs that have evidence of effectiveness. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of hypothetical students. One student that's kind of working, that's in the MTSS RTI process, and another student that's in the special education process, and thinking about kind of what this might look like for beginning the process and identifying an intervention program. So this is Isabella. She's a third grader that's new to the school. And as part of the school's universal screening process, she's been identified as a student that may not be meeting grade level reading goals or is at risk from not meeting grade level reading goals. So the team decides that she needs supplemental Tier 2 intervention. And based on her needs and assessment data, they've decided that Intervention Program A, which is a comprehensive, scripted, systematic program, is going to be best to meet her needs. They've chosen this program because it's a program that they use in their school. Their teachers and interventionists are trained to implement this. And again, the skills and reading strategies that it teaches aligns with the needs of a number of their students in that school. And it's determined that this program is going to be implemented 3 days per week in groups of 6. And it's going to be implemented by the general education teacher. So that's example one within an MTSS process. We can also think about this within a special education process. So this is Matt. He was referred for evaluation to special education comprehensive evaluation by his third grade teacher because of concerns with reading. And the team decided that he's eligible for special education services with a learning disability in reading. So the team got together to develop his individualized education program, and they decided that he has a need for small group reading intervention. And based on his needs and assessment data, they determined that this program, Intervention Program A, is the most appropriate choice to meet his needs based on information about Matt's needs and challenges, and because this is a program that they feel like they can implement with a high level of integrity and fidelity. And for Matt, he's going to receive Intervention Program A 4 times per week in groups of 5, and it's going to be delivered by the special education teacher. Okay, so we are going to do a couple of quick activities here. This first activity, which is a stop and jot, is there's going to be a video on the next slide of a teacher just talking a little bit about their approach to validated intervention programs. And as you watch this video, jot down some notes in your workbook of some things that you hear that either are consistent with what we've been talking about or maybe things that you're not sure that they're thinking about this the right way. Also, in your workbook, there'll be a transcription of what the teacher is saying so that you're able to look at that after you view the video to remind you of what the teacher is saying. You can underline things in that script.
I have a small group of students who really need support with comprehension. So I looked at the National Center for Intensive Intervention's website and found a program that specifically targets comprehension. I didn't read the studies, but I was able to determine that the program was evaluated with students with similar needs and at similar grades as my students. I spent a while reading the manual and watching training videos online, so I feel like I've been able to implement the program correctly. I know fidelity is important, so I'm trying to teach the way it is written, following the scope and sequence and the script.
So we watched a video of a teacher talking about their use of validated intervention programs. And let's sort of talk through this a little bit and see about some of the potential things that you may have jotted down or pulled out about the use of intervention programs. So this teacher said that I have a small group of students who really need support with comprehension. So that's an important piece here. She understands that this is the area of need for the students that she's thinking about. So I looked at the National Center for Intensive Interventions, and we already talked about that this is a site where you can get information about intervention programs and about the level of evidence that supports those programs. And found a program that specifically targets comprehension. So she's looking specifically for a program that's going to help her students with reading comprehension. She says, I didn't read the studies, but I was able to determine that the program was evaluated with students with similar needs and at similar grades as my students. So should she be reading the research studies that support this program? I think that's possibility, but I don't think that teachers necessarily have to be reading original research on all these, especially if they're relying on sources like NCII or other clearinghouses that summarize and compile and synthesize the evidence for teachers about the effectiveness of program and who it's best for. Even though she didn't read the studies, she's using a good process to determine whether or not this is an appropriate program for her students and has evidence. I spent a while reading the manual and watching training videos online. This is the place where she's really trying to understand how to implement the program the way it was intended. We might say that ideally it would be great if she was receiving some systematic training on this program, but it sounds like that she's making an attempt to really carefully think about how this program is supposed to be implemented, and there's also some training videos that she's using. So she feels like that she's been able to implement the program correctly. She says, I know that fidelity is important, so I'm trying to teach it the way it's written. So at this point of the DBI process, we're not thinking about making adjustments or making intensifications. We're really focusing on implementing a validated program with fidelity because we know that there's evidence to suggest that if we implement it that way, students will respond. And so she's following the scope and sequence and the script of the program. So now let's watch another teacher talking a little bit about validated intervention programs. So the same thing, watch this video on the next slide, jot down some notes, refer to the script of the teacher so that you can underline and mark things, and we'll talk about this again after you watch the video.
I'm using a good program with my students who need reading support. My students need help with phonics and decoding, and this program is really aligned to their needs. It contains a series of practice activities that target different phonics skills, and I can pick and choose which worksheets are best for each student. I know teaching phonics is an evidence-based approach, so I feel good about this program.
Okay, so this teacher started off saying that I'm using a good program with my students who need reading support. My students need help with phonics and decoding. So she has done a good job of identifying what her students need. So she's really focusing, trying to find something that focuses on phonics and decoding. And this program is really aligned to their needs. It contains a series of practice activities that target phonics skills, and I can pick and choose which worksheets are best for each student. So in this case, we see that this is a teacher that's not necessarily found a program that has this comprehensive scope and sequence that's a validated program. It feels like a series of activities or worksheets that might reinforce phonics and decoding, but it doesn't sound like a comprehensive intervention program. So it's sort of a series of activities and a series of worksheets. So in some ways, this may not be fitting our definition of what an evidence-based program is. She's also saying that she gets to kind of pick and choose which worksheets are best for her students. And again, this is something that at this stage of the DBI process, we're really focusing on implementing intervention programs with fidelity the way that they were written. So in this case, she's picking and choosing some things which could be good for practice or at a different stage, but it's not necessarily meeting the requirements or the way we think about both the type of intervention programs that we're selecting and how to implement those programs with fidelity as part of the DBI process. She says, I know teaching phonics is an evidence-based approach, so I feel good about this program. And it's true, we know that phonics is an important skill. There's a lot of evidence that teaching phonics is effective. But at this point, we want to focus on identifying a systematic, comprehensive program that teaches phonics rather than just coming up with activities and lessons and worksheets that focus on phonics. She says, I feel good about this program, and it's great that if we like a program or feel good about it, but the goal of DBI is to really be able to refer to evidence about the effectiveness of the tools and the strategies and the practices that we're using. So in an upcoming module, we'll learn a lot more about validated intervention programs, and we'll learn about how intervention programs support students and teachers, what are the different intervention program options for teaching reading. We'll learn about how to evaluate an intervention program's materials, how to dig deep into the materials to understand what it's teaching, how it's teaching, whether that's going to meet the needs of our students, and also how to evaluate an intervention program's research evidence. So how to be able to see whether or not there's rigorous evidence supporting the effectiveness of this program. And that'll be, again, in an upcoming module. So the next step of the DBI process is progress monitoring. And so when we think about implementing an intervention program, we want to know if it's working, right? So progress monitoring is a way to collect data on students in an ongoing way to really be able to answer questions like, is our intervention working? Because even if we make a really good choice with identifying an evidence-based reading program and we're implementing it with fidelity, that doesn't guarantee that our students are going to be responding to that or meeting the needs of our students, right? So we want to have data to let us know whether or not that intervention is effective, is being effective, is working with those students. We also want to know if students are making progress at an acceptable rate. It's one thing to be making progress, but we want to put that progress in context of where we're hoping that student's going to be going. We want to compare it to goals for progress and benchmarks. So not just are they making progress, but are they making enough progress and appropriate progress? So progress monitoring can help us with that too. And then most importantly, it answers questions like, do I need to adjust or intensify intervention and instruction for this student? If students aren't responding, we need to do something and change something. And so progress monitoring gives us the information about whether we need to adjust or intensify and to help us think about what that might look like. So in assessment, we have all kinds of terms that refer to different kinds of assessments for different purposes. And when we're talking about progress monitoring, we're really focusing on these two things, right? We're talking about general outcome measures, and oftentimes we're talking about curriculum-based measurement. So when we're talking about general outcome measures, these are progress monitoring assessments that meet these, that have these features, right? These are measures that evaluate overall progress towards meeting grade level expectations. So they're not necessarily aligned with necessarily specific programs. It's not telling you if students have mastered skills that you're teaching as part of a program. It's a kind of broader overall construct in reading, like oral reading fluency, for example, that is telling you and giving you an indication whether students are making progress towards large goals. And so that means that these are program independent assessments. We can use these progress monitoring tools regardless of what type of reading intervention we're using. So it doesn't have to be specific to an intervention program. It's telling us if students are making progress towards a broader benchmark, and that, again, these are general outcomes that we're measuring. So these are not aligned with programs, and they also have to have levels of technical adequacy and reliability and validity. So these are progress monitoring tools that have been developed and evaluated by researchers. We also don't want these to take away from instruction. So these are going to be short probes. There's often multiple forms. They're administered often, and we graph students' progress. They are often given once a week, once every couple of weeks, so that we really have real-time, ongoing information about whether our interventions are working and students are responding. So similar to intervention programs in reading, we have a lot of great options for progress monitoring tools in reading. So some of these are systems or progress monitoring tools that we may be familiar with, and again, have evidence of working and being able to capture the information that we need. And again, there's on the National Center for Intensive Interventions website, there's a tool chart that lists and evaluates different kinds of measures for progress monitoring and reading. And in a future module, we'll be talking a lot more about how to think about those kinds of measures. So let's go back to our students and talk a little bit about how progress monitoring supports the DBI process for them. So remember Isabella, she's a student that's new to the school. As part of the MTSS process, she was identified as needing Tier 2 supplemental intervention. And so she's receiving Intervention Program A that's being delivered by the general education teacher 3 times a week and in groups of 6. So what we think we made a really good decision about this program and its alignment to be able to meet Isabella's needs, but we want to see if that's actually the case. So here's an example of what progress monitoring data might look like for a student like Isabella. So what we have here is the red solid line is her progress monitoring data. So you can see that this is collecting data from September through December, and it looks like that they're collecting progress monitoring data for her every week. So you see that there's a new data point every week, and you can see the trend of her progress over September and October. So the dotted line is a line that sort of shows where she started and then shows where we'd like her to be at the end of December, a benchmark goal or a reading goal for this measure for that time period. And so the dotted line represents the aim line, right? So we want to see her progress matching that line over time. And that's going to show us that she's making not just progress, but adequate progress to be able to meet the end of the year or the end of the fall goal. And we can see here, based on these progress monitoring data points, that it looks like she's on track to meet that end of fall goal, that her data points are clustering around that aim line. So that means that we're feeling pretty good about her response to this intervention. And at this point, we probably don't need to think about making any kind of intervention changes or adaptations because she's responding well to the intervention. So the other student that we've been talking about is Matt. He's a student that's been identified as a student with disability in reading and has an IEP. And as part of his IEP, it's been determined that he will receive Intervention Program A in a small group, 4 times a week, group of 5, delivered by the special education teacher. And again, we feel like this was a good decision about choosing an intervention that's going to meet his needs, but we also want to see if that's actually the case. So here's an example of progress monitoring data for Matt, and it's the same setup. We see that he's getting assessed every week on these short probes of general reading outcome. And we also see the aim line, which again goes from where he started to where we would like him to be at the end of the fall. And when we look at his data, we can see that it's fairly flat. Like he's making a little bit of growth, but it's certainly not clustered around that goal line or that aim line. So this is giving us information that even though we made a really good kind of process to think about what would work for him, it actually is not seeming to be working the way we thought it would. And the really important thing here is we have this information now. We didn't have to wait until December to determine that this intervention wasn't working for him. We have sort of real-time data right now that tells us that if he continues to make this level of progress, he's not going to meet that end of fall goal. So it gives us really powerful real-time information about making decisions about how we can perhaps intensify or adjust or adapt the intervention to better meet his needs and to accelerate his growth. Okay, so we are going to now listen to a few teachers kind of talk about their use of progress monitoring. And again, listen to what they're saying, and then jot down some thoughts about their use of progress monitoring in your workbook.
We use CBM measures in our school for progress monitoring. We give them in the fall, winter, and spring. I'm really pleased with the growth of one of my students with reading difficulties. He made great growth between fall and winter, so I know he's responding to our intervention plan.
So this teacher said, we use CBM measures in our school for progress monitoring. So CBM measures are a kind of progress monitoring measure that has a lot of evidence of reliability and validity, and so that's a good choice for thinking about progress monitoring. The teacher said we give them in the fall, winter, and spring. And so in a sense, that makes me think more like these are being used for benchmarking. A lot of times we want to kind of get a sense of how everybody in the school is doing in fall, winter, and spring, and that helps us know the level of risk. But in terms of progress monitoring, that's probably not enough to really get a sense of intervention is working or not. Think back to Matt, for example. If we had only monitored progress at the very beginning of the fall and then again in winter, we wouldn't learn that he wasn't responding to this intervention until a long time has passed, and it kind of doesn't give us that opportunity to make those adjustments quickly and ongoing. So probably this is a teacher that's thinking more about benchmarking or screening rather than progress monitoring. The teacher says, I'm really pleased with the growth of one of my students with reading difficulties. And the teacher said he made great growth between fall and winter, so I know he is responding to our intervention plan. So again, we hear that the student is making growth between fall and winter, but we don't really know how to compare that growth. We don't know whether that's enough growth, because we can think about students that are making growth but are actually continuing to fall further and further behind. So it doesn't seem like we have some kind of goal or benchmark or rate of progress that we're using to think about whether this growth is adequate or acceptable. And so the teacher says, I know he is responding to our intervention plan. Again, he's responding in some way, but we don't really know whether that response is what we're hoping for or adequate. So this is a teacher that is using progress monitoring data, but probably needs to rethink a little bit how they're using it, particularly when we're thinking about the process of DBI. Okay, now let's watch another video of a teacher talking about how they use progress monitoring. Same thing, watch the video, jot down some notes in your workbook.
We use CBM measures in our school for progress monitoring. We give them every week for students who are receiving reading intervention. I'm really pleased with the growth of one of my students with reading difficulties. After a little bit of a slow start, his progress has been consistently above the aim line for meeting the end of the school year benchmark for oral reading fluency, so I know he is responding to our intervention plan.
Okay, let's think a little bit about what this teacher was saying around using progress monitoring. So the teacher said, we use CBM measures in our school for progress monitoring. And again, we know that CBM measures are an effective tool for progress monitoring. This teacher said we give them every week, which is important. That's more of an appropriate schedule for giving progress monitoring because we want to get that kind of timely data. And we give them for students who are receiving reading intervention. Right? So progress monitoring doesn't have to happen for every student in the school. We really only need that kind of progress monitoring data for those students that we're concerned about, and we really want to have that kind of ongoing information about whether they're responding to intervention. This teacher said, I'm really pleased with the growth of one of my students in reading difficulties. After a little bit of a slow start, his progress has been consistently above the aim line. So this teacher is talking about that the student is making growth, but they're comparing that growth to an aim line, which is the goal for how much growth that student needs to make to be able to reach the end of the year or end of the semester benchmark. And teacher says, I know he is responding to our intervention plan. So when the teacher says that they know the student is responding, we feel good about that because of these other things being in place, that they're using the right kind of tools, they're monitoring progress at the right schedule, they've done a good job kind of setting goals and benchmarks, and they have a criterion for determining whether or not that student is making adequate progress. So in an upcoming module, we'll talk a lot more about progress monitoring, and some of the things that will be covered in that module will be how to select and administer and score reading CBMs, or curriculum-based measures. We'll also be talking about how to determine a baseline for where students are starting and how to set goals for where we would like to see progress, or to decide what adequate growth might be. And then also how that we use those data from progress monitoring measures to make instructional decisions, which is the most important component. The next step of the data-based individualization, or DBI process, is collecting diagnostic information. And collecting diagnostic information answers really important questions that we have about students in intervention. Questions like, why is the student not responding to the intervention? What specific reading skills and strategies does the student need? Is the student learning the content that I'm teaching? And what information can help inform decisions about adjusting or intensifying instruction? So when we think about collecting this kind of information about students, there's a number of different kinds of assessments or terminology that we use to think about what these assessments look like. Things like skill inventory, or CBM, curriculum-based measurement, error analysis, program-specific assessments, CBA, or curriculum-based assessment probes, and also things like standardized assessments. And in the DBI process, we focus on the first 4 of these, and we think less about standardized assessments. So some of the kind of information that we want to collect to give us information about why students may not be responding to intervention the way we want are some things like skill inventories. So these are basically assessments that really get at what kind of specific skills and strategies students have mastered and which are areas that they have need. So it could look at something like this, where they're reading specific words that have different types of vowel combinations or different kind of patterns or different kinds of letters and parts to see kind of what types of words students are having difficulty reading. So that's an example of something, a skill inventory that could be something that we collect on students. Another thing could be CBM error analysis. So we're collecting CBM data for progress monitoring to see whether or not students are making progress at the level and the rate that we want. But we can also look at those assessments to get some really good information about how they're reading those passages, specifically when we're talking about oral reading fluency. So we can see the kinds of word errors or the kinds of errors that students are making when they're reading these oral reading fluency passages. What kinds of errors they're making, what kinds of word types, polysyllabic words. So we can get a lot of really good diagnostic information from CBM assessments. We can also look at things like program-specific assessments. Many intervention programs come with probes or assessments that are embedded within the program that give us really good information about whether students are mastering the content that's being taught as part of the intervention. And that's, in some ways, the kind of key information that we want. Are students learning the information that we're teaching? Are they learning the reading skills and strategies that we're teaching? And we can get really good real-time information from program-embedded assessments. And finally, we can also think about developing CBA probes, curriculum-based assessment. These are coming up with alternate probes that get at and assess the kinds of word types or the kinds of skills that we're teaching. So these lists may be different combinations of words that all have CBC patterns. And we can see whether or not students are making progress on reading these kinds of words, and we can give these regularly to see if students are mastering content. So when we're thinking about collecting this kind of diagnostic or mastery assessment, let's think a little bit and go back to one of our student examples. So remember, Matt is a student who is receiving intervention in Intervention Program A. The team decided that that was an evidence-based intervention program that best met the needs for Matt. And he's receiving this 4 times a week in groups of 5 and delivered by the special education teacher. And remember, when we were progress monitoring him, these were the data that we saw, and based on our goal for growth in the intervention, we see that Matt isn't making the kind of progress that we want. So we're sort of circling back to collect some information to get a better understanding of the kinds of skills and strategies that he's mastering, to get a little bit more sense of that diagnostically what his needs are. And so for Matt, as part of this example, we go back and we look at CBM error analysis on some of those probes, the same probes that we were using for progress monitoring. We also look at some of the assessments that come out of the Intervention Program A. And finally, we may supplement that with some skills inventories to get a sense of some of the specific words or strategies that he's mastered or not. And after an examination of some of those kinds of diagnostic and mastery assessment data, we've determined that Matt is having particular difficulty with vowel combinations, reading polysyllabic words with more than 1 syllable, difficulty with automaticity, and with reading fluency. So doing that kind of assessment gives us a sense of here are the kinds of things that Matt is struggling with within the context of his intervention right now. And we're going to keep that in mind as we think about adapting and intensifying intervention for Matt. So you're going to watch the video on the next slide, and you're going to jot down some of your thoughts about the use of diagnostic and mastery assessment in your workbook.
One of the students in my reading intervention group isn't responding the way I'd like. His progress monitoring data is below his aim line. I'm going to look closely at the assessments included in the intervention program to see what content he's learning and what parts he's having trouble with. I'm also going to look back at his CBM assessments from the past month and see if I can get a better understanding of what type of word reading errors he is making. I'm pretty sure this is the right intervention for him, but I want to get specific information that might help me figure out how I can best adjust the intervention to better meet his needs.
Okay, let's review the video. In this video, the teacher is talking about one of the students, and the teacher said, one of the students in my reading intervention group isn't responding the way I like. His progress monitoring data is below his aim line. So this is good. The teacher is looking at progress monitoring data and seeing that he's not making the kind of progress that would get him to benchmark or get him to meet the end of year goal. I'm going to look closely at the assessments included in the intervention program. So that's good. The student or the teacher is really looking carefully at what that student is mastering in that particular intervention program to see what content he's learning and what parts he's having trouble with. So we're going to focus on some of the areas that are difficult. I'm also going to look back at a CBM assessments from the past month and see if I can get a better understanding of what type of word reading errors he is making. So we're also going to look at assessment data that we've already corrected and recent data from the CBM probes. I'm pretty sure this is the right intervention for him, but I want to get specific information that might help me figure out how I can best adjust the intervention to better meet his needs. So in this example, the teacher is making some good decisions within the DBI process to really think about collecting the most, the best kind of information and the most immediate and the most recent information that's going to help make these kind of adjustments and adaptations. So now watch the video on the next slide and also jot down your thoughts about the use of diagnostic and mastery assessments in your workbook.
My student's progress monitoring data is showing that she isn't making the kind of growth we were hoping for. So I looked back at the results of her comprehensive evaluation last spring. Based on the standardized assessment we gave her then, like the Woodcock-Johnson and CTOP, it looks like she has weaknesses in auditory processing and short-term memory. I'm not sure if the intervention program we have her in addresses those things, so I'm thinking about trying to find a different intervention for her. I'm also going to look at the diagnostic profile we got for her from our state reading exam.
Okay, in this example, the teacher says that my student's progress monitoring data is showing that she is not making the kind of growth that we were hoping for. So again, basing this conversation on progress monitoring data, which is a good thing. That's we want to be using data to understand whether students are responding. So I looked back at the results of her comprehensive evaluation last spring. In a sense, in the DBI process, this might not be the best choice for thinking about diagnostic information because these data at this point are a little bit old and we're not really getting information from this exactly about how the student is responding to the intervention that's in place. Based on the standardized assessment we gave her then, like the Woodcock-Johnson and CTOP, it looks like she has weaknesses in auditory processing and short-term memory. So these are kinds of assessments that we give to really think about understanding the students' disability status and eligibility for IDEA, but they're not necessarily the kind of assessments that are going to be the most useful when we're trying to adjust instruction based on responsiveness to an intervention. So these are all really important sources of information for some kind of decisions, but not necessarily for the kind of decisions that we're making about how to best adjust intervention. I'm not sure if the intervention program we have her in addresses those things, so I'm thinking about trying to find a different intervention for her. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but changing interventions isn't always the best first decision to make when we're thinking about how to adjust instruction intervention for students that aren't responding. I'm also going to look at the diagnostic profile we got for her from our state reading exam. Again, another example of an assessment that really isn't a kind of immediate curriculum-based understanding of how the student is responding. So this is less of a good example of how to think about mastery and diagnostic information and assessment data within a DBI process. So in upcoming modules, there will be a focus on learning more about diagnostic and mastery assessment within a data-based individualization process for reading. And some of the kinds of things that will be addressed is how to identify specific skills and strategies to teach, and how to use diagnostic and mastery assessment data to make decisions about adjusting or intensifying instruction. So the next step in the DBI process is thinking about making intervention adaptations. So we have information that students are not responding the way we'd like to our intervention decisions, and we have some helpful diagnostic and mastery assessment data that can help inform some of the adaptations that we make. So when we think about intervention adaptations, I think that the main message for thinking about this within a DBI process is that we don't need to start over. I think sometimes our first thoughts about what do we do when students aren't responding is to switch to something different. We need a different intervention program, we need a different approach, we need to start over. And I think the message here, and something that's really helpful for the DBI process, is thinking that we don't necessarily need to start over with a new program or to start from scratch. Instead, what we want to think about is increasing the level of intensity of the supports that we're providing students. And we think of intensity not as sort of an either-or kind of thing, but on a continuum, that we can adjust intensity on a number of different variables and dimension to increase the supportiveness, to increase the intensity, to increase the effectiveness of the intervention approach that we're working with. So we're going to be talking a little bit about introduction to some of these types of intervention adaptations that increase the intensity of the intervention process and the intervention strategies. And we're going to be thinking about two different types of intervention adaptations. One is structural adaptations, and the second is instructional adaptations. And so we're going to start by talking a little bit about structural adaptations. Instructional adaptations are ways to think about increasing intensity of intervention through these almost kind of structural or infrastructure or systems level decisions that can increase intensity. So for example, thinking about adapting or adjusting things like time and dosage of intervention, thinking about the scheduling of intervention, thinking about group size, thinking about the kinds of training and support that different interventionists have, and then also thinking about potentially incorporating some kinds of behavior supports within the intervention program. So when we come back to think about Matt, we know right now that the team made decisions about providing Matt with intervention program A and doing that 4 times per week in a group of 5 done by the special education teacher. So we're at the stage now where we're thinking about how to adapt this and make it more intensive to better meet the needs of Matt. And so we can go through some of those structural adaptation dimensions. So for example, we could think about time and dosage. Right now, Matt is receiving 4 times per week. Maybe that's 20 minutes 4 times a week. And one of the things that we know is a really powerful adaptation that increases the intensity of intervention is increasing the time or the dosage. So thinking about providing more time in intervention. So maybe for Matt, it becomes 5 times a week for 30 minutes per day, or 5 times a week for 40 minutes per day. Right? That's a significant increase in intensity that has potential likelihood to increase the effectiveness of the intervention for Matt. Another thing we can think about is scheduling, and this is sort of when this happens. So it might be that the team decides that intervention may be more effective if it's sort of previewing Tier 1 instruction, or maybe it's reviewing Tier 1 instruction, so the time of the day may be important. It may be also something that there could be cross-class or cross-grade groupings that would be more effective for Matt. We can also think about group size. We know that the smaller the group is, the more intensive that the instruction or intervention can be. So for Matt, instead of having groups of 5, we may think about a group of 3 or a group of 2 and really think about what the needs of those students are to really try to match the needs of the students with the intervention, particularly around students that have similar needs as Matt. We can also think about interventionist training or support. So we want to have the highest quality, most trained interventionists working with the kids that have the most significant needs. So that maybe in Matt's school that the special education teacher that's providing this intervention isn't the person that's the most highly trained on this intervention. Maybe there's another specialist in the school that has advanced expertise in intervention A. Another option would be that the interventionist or the special education teacher that's providing this intervention could receive additional training in intervention program A. And we know that the level of expertise and familiarity and fluency with intervention programs makes a difference in their effectiveness and how well they align with the needs of students that have significant reading difficulties. Finally, one of the reasons that students might not be responding to an intervention is the level of engagement. and on-task behavior. So another way to think about a structural adaptation for an intervention is to think about how we can better include behavior supports into that intervention. So helping the interventionist or the special education teacher in this case do a better job of incorporating strategies to reinforce engagement and on-task behavior, maybe adding in some kind of check-in, check-out monitoring of engagement and behavior in that group. Those are other ways to intensify the intervention based on some of these structural elements and components. So watch the video on the next slide and jot down your thoughts about the use of structural adaptations in your workbook.
We have a student that isn't responding to her current reading intervention, so we know that we need to intensify intervention for her. Right now, she is receiving a systematic Tier 2 intervention program from her classroom teacher, 3 days per week for 30 minutes. This teacher is really good, but she doesn't have the same level of training as our reading specialist, who has extensive experience providing intensive interventions. Our reading specialist uses a different, highly structured program, and she has room in one of her intervention groups that meets 40 minutes 2 times per week. We think this is the right adaptation for her.
So this teacher started off by saying that we have a student that isn't responding to her current reading intervention, so that we know that we need to intensify intervention for her. So again, this is all based on data that suggests that the student isn't responding. Right now, she is receiving a systematic Tier 2 intervention program from her classroom teacher, 3 days per week for 30 minutes. All right, so we have some information about some of these structural elements. It's getting a Tier 2 program, it's being delivered by the classroom teacher, and it's 3 days a week for 30 minutes. This teacher is really good, but she doesn't have the same level of training as our reading specialist. So this is the idea of thinking a little bit about the expertise of the interventionist, who has extensive experience providing intensive interventions. Our reading specialist uses a different, highly structured program, and she has room in one of her intervention groups that meets 40 minutes 2 times per week. So this is the part here we have to think a little bit more carefully about. So we see that the reading specialist has expertise in a different intervention program. So one of the things that's happening here is we're switching intervention programs for this student. And eventually this might be the right decision. But through the DBI process, we want to try increasing the intensity of the current intervention approach before we shift interventions. So in this case, because this reading specialist has more expertise, we're kind of prioritizing that over the idea of trying to think about structural adaptations. So that may be something that is a good idea at some point, but not as consistent with the DBI process as the other example. The other thing about this is this group is meeting 40 minutes 2 times per week. So when you think about increasing intensity, this actually turns out to be less overall intervention time than the student had before. Right, so 3 days for 30 minutes turns out to be 90 minutes, 2 days for 40 minutes turns out to be 80 minutes. So actually, this adjustment, this structural adjustment, is decreasing the time of intervention for this student. And that's something that we want to be really careful about. And so, in a sense, these are the kind of things that sometimes we see in school, but it may not be the most effective way to think about making structural adaptations to increase the intensity of intervention within a DBI process. So let's watch the next video on the next slide and jot down your thoughts about the use of structural adaptations for this example.
We have a student that isn't responding to her current reading intervention, so we know that we need to intensify intervention for her. Right now, she is receiving a systematic Tier 2 intervention program from her classroom teacher 3 days per week for 30 minutes. Based on diagnostic and mastery data, we think this is the right intervention program for her, but she needs increased time in a smaller group. Our reading specialist meets with a group of 3 students for 40 minutes, 5 days per week, using the same program. So we think this is the right adaptation for her.
This teacher says, we have a student that isn't responding to her current reading intervention, so that we know we need to intensify intervention for her. So again, starting off from the same place, using data to understand that we need to do something to intensify intervention. Right now, she is receiving a systematic Tier 2 intervention program from her classroom teacher, 3 days per week for 30 minutes. So it's the same kind of setup as the other example. Based on diagnostic and mastery data, we think this is the right intervention program for her. So already this group is thinking about that this was a good decision about this intervention program, and collecting mastery and diagnostic data has reaffirmed to this team that this is the right intervention. The focus and the content of this intervention is designed and aligned with the needs of this student. But she needs increased time in a smaller group. So this group is thinking about structural adaptations around two really powerful components, which is more time in a smaller group. So our reading teacher, our reading specialist, meets with a group of 3 students for 40 minutes 5 times a week using the same program. So we think this is the right adaptation for her. So again, this is more of a positive example of thinking about structural adaptations that makes a real difference in intensity by increasing the time for intervention, as well as decreasing the group size. And also changing interventionists, where the reading interventionist or the reading specialist probably has more expertise for providing this kind of intensive intervention than the classroom teacher. So this is a positive example of thinking about how to adjust structural adaptations to increase intensity. So we talked a little bit about structural adaptations for increasing intensity of intervention. We could also talk about instructional adaptations. And when we think about instructional adaptations, one of the ways that's really helppful for me to think about this is a lot of times when we think about instruction, reading intervention, we focus on what we teach. And that's critical, right? We really want to make sure that we're aligning our intervention with students' needs and focusing on the components of reading that are essential for that student, things like phonics or reading fluency or reading comprehension. So we think a lot about, are these the right skills that we're teaching? Does this program include the right skills and strategies, the right area of reading for these students? But sometimes what we don't think as much about is how we teach. And we know for students that are experiencing reading difficulties is that how we teach can be just as important, just as impactful as what we teach. When we think about it, how we teach can really make the difference between whether or not students are going to learn these important skills and strategies, master this kind of content, or whether or not that kind of communication of the information is less effective. So when we're thinking about instructional adaptations, we focus on how we teach. And we have an extensive literature that talks about principles of effective instruction and intervention. And a lot of this is focused around the research on explicit instruction. How do we provide explicit instruction to students that maximizes the likelihood that they're going to be learning what we teach? So when we think about instructional adaptation, some of the things we think about are providing effective models of skills and strategies, making sure that we give students effective guided practice and different types of practice opportunities, making sure that we elicit frequent responses that make sure that students are highly engaged in instruction and practicing skills and being able to do something and engage with the skills and the content. And also making sure that we give immediate specific feedback to students as they're, especially at these initial stages of learning, and especially for students that are having difficulty with the content. So when we think back to our example of Matt, Matt is receiving Intervention Program A. And we know that Intervention Program A is the right focus based on our initial identification of this program, and then based on diagnostic and mastery assessment, we know that Intervention A focuses on the right skills and content, the what we teach. But there may be some room to be able to adapt and adjust the way that Program A provides support to interventionists on how to teach those skills. So for example, this intervention program may be somewhat brief or vague on the instructions for the interventionist. It might say something like, have students practice reading CVC words, which may be the right content for Matt. But we can think about whether or not we can deliver this content through principles of explicit instruction that increase the intensity and make it more likely that students are going to learn that content. So some of those things that we can think about are things like effective models. Sometimes intervention programs don't have these explicit models built into the intervention. And one of the things that we can do is make sure that interventionists are modeling skills and strategies multiple times before asking students to do that. So for example, instead of just saying how students practice reading CVC words, we might make sure that there's effective models incorporated, saying things like, watch me read this word. I'll touch under each letter and say its sound. I won't stop between the sounds. Listen to me, mud. The word is mud. and then maybe even modeling another example or another few examples for students before asking them to do it. Another thing is to think about effective guided practice, making sure that we're giving students really highly scaffolded practice on new skills and strategies. Now it's your turn to read this word. I'm going to touch under a square, and you're going to say the letter. Don't stop between the sounds. Get ready. And then the student would sound out mud and read it fast, mud. And there may be different levels of scaffolding that we include in these kind of guided practice opportunities. Maybe we start by practicing the letter sounds by themselves. Maybe students are at a place where they can take away some of the scaffolding. I'll touch under each letter and you say the sound in your head, and then we'll read it out loud together. Or everyone sound out this word in your head, and when I touch the word, you read it. So making sure that we're really thinking carefully about the kinds of guided practice that we're providing to students within an intervention program. We also know that the more that students are actively engaged in the instruction and doing things, responding, reading words, writing things down, that the more effective the instruction will be. We almost can kind of count up the number of student opportunities to practice or respond, and that will be highly correlated with mastery of content. So what we can do is think about how to make sure and incorporate lots of practice opportunities and response opportunities within our intervention. Right, so we can think about individual practice opportunities, we can think about group practice opportunities. We want to make sure it's really fast-paced. We can think about additional examples to make sure that if there's not enough examples built into an intervention program, that we can include additional examples and really maximize and increase the opportunities for students to engage in practice and work on the skills and strategies that are being introduced. And finally, we can think about providing immediate specific feedback. We know that feedback is a key component of students mastering and learning content. And a lot of times, specific feedback strategies are not incorporated in intervention programs. So really focusing on how interventionists are going to respond to student answers. If they respond correctly, reinforcing that, a great job reading the word mud instead of just great job. And then if students are making mistakes, how to provide that kind of corrective feedback. If students start saying b, you can say that letter has b. What sound? B. Okay, try again. Right. So correcting immediately by modeling the correct answer, giving additional practice opportunities with feedback is going to ensure that students are better able to learn the content. So with that, we can think about intervention program A. We can think about the idea that diagnostic and mastery assessment has shown that he's having difficulties with vowel combinations, polysyllabic words, automaticity, and fluency. And we can think about helping the interventionist really think about delivering intervention program A, ensuring that these principles of effective and explicit instruction are incorporated into that instruction. So talking about and providing support around how do we increase effective models? How do we make sure there's effective guided practice? How do we elicit frequent responses and provide immediate specific feedback? And particularly in those components of the program that are focusing on those areas of need for math. When we're teaching vowel combinations, we particularly want to make sure that we're incorporating these principles of effective and explicit instruction. So you've probably guessed, but we have now another video that will have a teacher talking a little bit about using instructional adaptations, and view the video and jot down some of your thoughts on the use of instructional adaptations in your workbook.
We have a student that isn't responding to his current reading intervention, so we know that we need to intensify intervention for him. The intervention program is evidence-based and targets the right skills, but the teacher guide is a little vague about how the interventionist should deliver the content. We think we can adapt the program by doing a better job incorporating principles of explicit instruction into the program materials.
So this teacher starts off saying, I have a student that isn't responding to his current reading intervention, so that we know we need to intensify intervention for him. The intervention program is evidence-based and targets the right skills, but the teacher guide is a little vague about how the interventionist should deliver the content. We think we can adapt the program by doing a better job incorporating principles of explicit instruction into the program materials. So again, this is a positive example that sort of reinforces this idea that we were just talking about, that we're not switching out interventions. We're not thinking necessarily about structural adaptations. We're thinking about whether we can teach this intervention program with better quality by incorporating principles of effective and explicit instruction. Right? And the idea here is that maybe the teacher's guide is a little bit vague about how to do that and is not necessarily explicit for how the interventionist should incorporate these principles of effective instruction. So we're going to work to figure out how to make sure that those things get built in. I mean, that can happen through either sort of training or professional development for the intervention, or even being more explicit by providing kind of notes or a guideline or a roadmap for how to build in these things in an explicit kind of scripted way. Okay, now watch the next video and jot down some thoughts about the use of instructional adaptations in this one.
We have a student that isn't responding to his current reading intervention, so we know that we need to intensify intervention for him. The intervention program is evidence-based and targets the right skills, but we think we can adapt the program by picking and choosing the activities that are most aligned with his needs and adding some different activities from another program.
So this starts off the same again. We have a student that isn't responding to his current reading intervention, so that we know we need to intensify instruction or intervention for him. The intervention program is evidence-based and targets the right skills. So again, this isn't a question about whether or not this is the right intervention or not, but we think we can adapt the program by picking and choosing the activities that are most aligned with his needs. So again, this is something we often do, which is kind of go outside the scope and sequence of the intervention program. And that can be really challenging to do. Basically, these intervention programs are powerful because they've been designed in such a way that skills and strategy are introduced in a really systematic way, comprehensive way, and build on each other over time. So when we're thinking about instructional adaptations, we don't think as much about picking and choosing which activities are going to work the best. Instead, what we try to do is stick to the sequence, scope and sequence for the most part, but think about how we can build in these principles of effective instruction into that scope and sequence, into those instructional activities. In this case, they're also adding some different activities from another program. For sure, there may be times when we need to supplement intervention programs to make sure that they are targeting the skills and strategies that the student needs, particularly based on these mastery and diagnostic information. But that might be something that comes a little bit later. So again, the kind of big idea about DBI is that we want to stay consistent and faithful to these evidence-based programs, but we want to make intervention adaptations in a systematic way that maintains the integrity of the programs, but increases intensity significantly to make it more likely that students will respond. So shifting around, jumping around in the program, in a sense, kind of isn't really sticking to the integrity of the program, but doing some things like adding extra models, giving additional practice, more examples. Those are the kind of things that we feel like maintain the evidence base behind the program, but make instructional adaptations in a way that will be really powerful and increase the response of students. So the modules that are focused on intervention adaptation will go into much more depth about how do we adapt interventions to include things like effective models, additional effective practice opportunities, frequent responses, and specific feedback. So finally, we've worked our way through the framework and the model for data-based individualization. And again, to me, one of the really key components of this is the intervention adaptation. That's the place where we're really making changes that can make a difference with student response. And we get information about how to make those adaptations based on assessment data. But once we make those adaptations, we want to see whether or not those have an effect, and in fact, students are responding to the adaptations that we make. So what we do at this point is continue to progress monitor to see whether or not students are responding to the adaptations that we've been making with intervention, both structural and instructional. So let's review Matt. Matt receives intervention program A. We've seen that through progress monitoring data, he's not responding the way that we would like, so we collected additional diagnostic and mastery assessment. We made some very key structural adaptations reducing the size of his intervention group, increasing the amount of times that that group meets, and also increasing the expertise of the interventionists. We've also made instructional adaptations by trying to better incorporate principles of effective and explicit instruction, increasing modeling, opportunities to practice, feedback. So we've tried to beef up the supportiveness of the intervention, both for the interventionist and for the student, and we want to continue to monitor progress. So remember, this is Matt's progress monitoring graph, and we want to continue to collect data, maybe even more frequently. So in this case, here are some additional data points that we're collecting, and for this example, we see that Matt is now definitely starting to respond in a stronger way to this intervention, and the slope of this is after this intervention change has increased and is looking positive and come closer to the aim line and meeting the end of the year goal. So we've gone through the process for DBI, and this is an iterative process. So that kind of loop between progress monitoring, collecting additional information through diagnostic and mastery assessment, making these kind of systematic informed intervention adaptations, and then continuing to monitor progress is the sort of active ingredient in DBI, right? It doesn't just happen once. It's this kind of continual loop between collecting data, making adaptations, and then seeing whether those adaptations work.